its value so that we can preserve it. And so we're thrilled to death that Mike is, doing the tours for us, and we really appreciate you coming. So thanks very much. If you have any questions, there's brochures in the bag that will direct you to the various websites or phone numbers, whatever you're interested in. And feel free to contact us with questions or any research or interest that you're interested in. So thanks very much. Mike?
Yeah. And if you're not a member of the Historical Society, please think about that, because I think it's a good organization, great organization, and keeps history alive, so to speak. And they sponsor these tours.
Right.
And so I won't get into finances, but it's amazing how much the liability insurance costs for this little event we're in right now.
Really?
So the money that you pay goes mainly for the liability insurance, so thank you very much. So we're going to start off on our tour of downtown Yreka, home to me, I guess to all of us right now, and a very special place. Whenever I drive up and down Minor Street, I get a special feeling in my soul and my heart, whatever. But so we're going to talk about the history of Minor Street, some of the things that were going on here and through the old days, some of the old characters perhaps that were here that I think are very interesting, and perhaps some of the things that you've never seen or never done in town, because it's amazing how much history there is in this couple of blocks area, and how many things have happened here. And well, I'm not going to go into them until we run into them. So anyway, so just a minute about how Yreka got started. We always have to start at the beginning. And if I was to go back to the Native American beginning, I don't know what I'd say, because I really don't know much about those times, other than there were Native Americans here. But what really got things happening from a modern history standpoint was when there were people traveling from Southern Oregon to Scott River. Both Southern Oregon and Scott River had already had gold discoveries in 1851, which was amazing, since the first gold discovery in all of West Coast was in 1848. So within just a very couple years, there were people scrambling all around, up and down through the Sierra Nevadas and the Coast Range between Oregon and California, and they found gold in many, many places, including Scott Bar and near Jacksonville, Oregon. There was a group of people traveling between those two areas. They decided to stop along the trail right up the road here, about 8 blocks, 10 blocks that direction, and they said, well, as long as we're here, let's check it out for gold, and they found gold there. It quickly became a gold rush town on its own. People flooded in to prospect for the gold that they had found further up the hill, and this little town got started down here, supposedly because it was out of the way of the gold. The gold was up there, so they built the town down here, and as we'll hear, the town kind of morphed. It changed from a gold rush town to other purposes. But what's ironic, and we were talking about this a little bit before the tour even started, is how even though the town was placed down here so that it'd be out of the way of the gold mining up there, they in fact did not do a very good job, because there's gold right here. And we're standing on it, no doubt. And the story I goes, Mr. Nelson, that owns this place right here, has documentation that there were not tunnels allowed underneath the Franco-American by ordinance. And so, but there's tunnels all around through town. And someday, if we're lucky, maybe we can have a tour where we can actually see some of the entryways, at least, to the tunnels. So, hi folks. So with that being said, the town got started because there was a gold rush right up the hill. In fact, if you go up to Discovery Park, you can see the nice monument and statue of the gold miner. And, oh, I forgot a very important thing, Carolyn, you should have kicked me. We have something that we started. It's called Historical Bingo. Would anybody like to play? Because there's amazing prizes that you win if you wish to play Historical Bingo.
I'm sorry.
And the way that this works is there will be, it's just like bingo.
I guess so.
You have a lot of little blocks in there that have some sort of information, and they will be things. Would you like to play the bingo? Sure. Sure, he would like to play. He looks very lucky to me. He has a good chance of winning, I suspect. So as you hear something that may be within the block, you can cross it out. But I have a little caution to give you. Not only do you block it out, but at the end, if you yell out, what do you yell out if you get a horizontal or vertical line or crossword? Bingo, of course. But then I have the right to ask you one of the questions on there. So it's not that you get to just cross it out, but you have to actually learn something about this. So this gets to be kind of stressful. So anyway, it's kind of fun. I think you would see that there's a lot of questions there that we will talk about on the way on our tour. And cross it out each time you think we covered that topic or found out something about it. With that being said, okay, you've got your game, the really exciting bingo game. We're going to talk about more about Yreka history and Minor Street doings through the years. So here we go. We're going to start down this way. How's that? We'll talk about the Franco-American Hotel when we probably get back, because that's a very important part of it. And that's, of course, where we start. But as I mentioned, Yreka got started as a gold rush town, but quickly it changed from just people flooding in here to try to find gold to the other things that a city could provide. And in the case of Yreka, it was not only all the store supplies, the groceries, the equipment, whatever, but Yreka happened to be located in a very important location. One was that from a transportation standpoint, it was in a natural corridor between Oregon and Central and Southern California. So this is the way that traffic would go between the population centers in those days. So it became a transportation hub right here. The other thing is that there was so much development going on. There was mining in virtually every location to the west of us. And there was agriculture, farming, ranching going on to the east of us. So each of those endeavors needed supplies. So when you have a major transportation hub where you can get equipment, you can get animals and wagons in, it makes it perfect for distribution of goods. And so Yreka morphed from a gold mining town to a transportation and a distribution and distribution of supplies type of community. So that's what kept Yreka going, is not the gold so much as but these other things that happened. And it became a very important center for that, for both those purposes. For instance, transportation. The people coming from California headed north into the Pacific Northwest or vice versa would have gone through Yreka almost always, unless they were by ship. They would have gone a different way. But to put that into context, the major stagecoach company that had the concession between Sacramento and Portland, their offices, their main office was located right here in Yreka. It was the largest, longest stagecoach transportation route in the United States. And if you come to my history tours of the 3rd Street, you'll see that before the houses that are located on 3rd Street now, that we think of these beautiful Victorian and other types of houses, before they were built, that was the center of where the animals were kept, maintained, where stagecoaches were made and repaired for this tremendous transportation system that we had based right out of here, out of Yreka. So come to my 3rd Street tour if you have. That'd be good. The earliest part of the town, like most gold rush towns, was probably in the earliest days. The structures were not, in fact, structures, but they were more of canvas. You know, they could be quickly put up. They were inexpensive, and that's probably what they did. Then they gradually, people, no doubt, with some sawmilling experience, started to mill some lumber, and they could make wood structures, which was a real problem in all these western towns because they were so susceptible to fire. And so that's what we're going to talk about, is the history of Yreka has had a number of bad fires. And we're going to talk about the one that happened in 1871. Yeah.
Did that start about the same time the gold did, or was that?
Well, I think it was very quickly after it. Yeah.
I always wondered about
Because where I live, there's the Fayok Ranch, and on the sign over it, I think it says Fayok Ranch 1852, I think.
that. Okay.
So that's about as soon after the gold rush to here, you know. So I think that my thought is that a lot of people were attracted by the allure of gold. You know, was in all the newspapers, and a lot of young men especially thought, wow, instead of working so hard back east, I'm going to try to go out west because maybe I'm going to be one of those lucky ones that can really hit it big. And they got out here and they found out it was so hard and it wasn't what they thought it was going to be, and so a lot of them reverted back to what they knew before. If they were farmers and ranchers, I think that was always a good way to revert back to. I mean, a lot of the lawyers did the same thing. We have a lawyer now. But, you know, they came out for the gold rush thinking they're going to make a lot of money, and they realized, wow, this is hard work being out here in the wet. And so I'm going to go back to lawyering. They need lawyers. They got all sorts of problems around here. So I'm going to become a lawyer, and they became successful people with their old career. So anyway, back to the fire. But thank you for the question. No, not at all. The fire, 1871, try to imagine in those days, if you heated, if you cooked, the fire was going pretty much all the time. And in probably just about every structure, you would have had to have fire. And when you had so many wood structures with fire, of course, that doesn't work out very well. And so all these towns had bad fires, and ours, the worst one was 1871. It started right behind this building now we could call the old bank building or the carousel building. It started right behind it. But at that time, this building did not exist at that time. But there was a Chinese laundry pretty much right at the back of where the building is now. And in those days, the Chinese had been, not totally, but they had strong pressure on them out of the gold mining areas because people were putting more taxes on them. There was a lot of effort to try to kick them out of California. And basically the Chinese tried to disappear by doing types of work that other people wouldn't do. And one of them was washing clothes. That was considered to be a very dirty, of course, job. And so there was a Chinese laundry. And 4th of July, 1871, they loved fireworks. They loved to have celebrations, and they set off a bunch of fireworks. Supposedly, according to the newspapers, it started a fire. There was a heavy north wind on the 4th of July, and it burned an area right through here, through a large part, all the way up through where the Catholic cemetery is, just to the east, to the left side of the courthouse, through this area right here. When I say it burned, it didn't necessarily destroy everything, but it damaged everything in this area. And many of the stores and buildings that we see right through here now kind of give us some indication of if they were badly damaged, totally destroyed, or whatever. For instance, the place right now, the Hardison Boutique, you can see has a really different architecture to the buildings outside of the A big part of that is the buildings of the Hardison Boutique. What would you call a remaining? It gives you a look of what things were like in probably 1850s. The buildings on either side do not. They're of a more recent vintage. A big part of that was because they were damaged and had to be not knocked down, but seriously redone. So as you go up and down Minor Street, you'll see kind of different looks to different buildings, and a part of it is a relic of the damage that occurred during the 1871 fire. Interesting thing that the newspapers were very good about mentioning that the help that the Native American people that happened to be in town at that time, including several Modocs and including a person by the name of Jack, or later Captain Jack, was here in town. In fact, he was here in town to confer, to look around, to buy some things, to probably have some fun, and to talk with some lawyers that lived right down 3rd Street. One of them, Mr. Roseborough, who was a prominent lawyer, and they were talking about some of the problems they were having with white folks take over their land 100 miles east of here. And so the newspaper thanked Captain Jack and some of the other Modocs for helping to put out the fire. And lo and behold, as we'll hear about just as we get down toward the end of the street, that in 1872, a year later, the Modoc Indians were in the newspaper not because they were helping put out the fire, but because they were in a war with the United States government. And so we'll hear about that. The building right here, we could call it the bank building, the old Bank of Siskiyou County. And this was one of the earliest banks that we had, and it was very prominent in some of the major financial dealings going on. I'm thinking specifically Yreka Western, which was the railroad that was built between Montague and here. And there's quite a bit of controversy about where the original railroad line was going to go as it connected between about Canyonville in Oregon and Reading. There was a period of time, 1872 to 1887, when there was still a gap in that railroad. There was railroad to the south of Reading, and there was railroad to the north of Canyonville, but no railroad in between. Finally, the railroad company decided to complete that, fill in that gap. The question was, where was it going to go through here? All of our local people went down to San Francisco, at least the city fathers went down to San Francisco to talk with the railroad owners to try to convince them that the railroad really needed to go through Yreka. It was such a perfect place for a railroad to go. And the railroad owners said, well, okay, thanks for coming, but no, we don't agree with you. That's not the perfect place. The perfect place is over in Shasta Valley. You know, it's kind of a straight line. It's kind of flat over there. You know, let's do that. Well, once the city fathers in Yreka heard about the railroad going to Montague, they got desperate because that was not good. It was not good to have the railroad go outside of your town. So very quickly, within a year, the Bank of Siskiyou County was a big part of it to go there to get the financing to build the Yreka Western from Montague to Yreka. So within a year or two after the railroad being through Siskiyou County, Yreka was had a rail connection.
Probably wouldn't have happened if Randolph was here.
Well, yeah, exactly. You need somebody with some power to
That's
get
right.
this. So we'll speak about, okay, Ron said something that deserves a little bit of talk. You know, anybody that's been around here a while knows about Randolph Collier, you know, and my grandmother used to say that she went to high school. She was a high school mate with Randolph. His family was from Scott Valley, and then they moved to 3rd Street here when he was a young person. But what was interesting about Randolph, and what Ron was alluding to, of course, was the power that he had within the state of California. We have, I don't know how many monuments in this town. No matter where you go, you see either a statue or a plaque or something about Randolph. But he was an example of old-time politics, I suppose, that he was from a small community, small county, but he had a lot of power. He was in control for a long time. He knew politics. And I guess one of his claims to fame around here was that he was able to get legislation that pretty much forced Interstate 5 to go right through Yreka. And not only that, but to put in 3 off-ramps. Right? And someone said at one of the other tours, they said, do you know Medford only has 2 off-ramps? Yeah. And I thought, I hadn't thought about that. And I was thinking, well, now, how many off-ramps do the other towns in Siskiyou County have? Okay, how many does Weed have? 3. How many does Mount Shasta have? 3. Dunsmuir has 3. And Medford has 2. I mean, that shows you Randolph Collier, you know. Yeah. So he said, Well, it may make sense to put the railroad through Shasta Valley over by Montague, but I've got enough power to make sure it comes right through Yreka and force the trucks to go over Anderson Grade, whether they want to or not. So anyway, I wasn't going to go there, but Ron forced me to go.
Sorry.
Anyway. Ming's, you know, whenever I drive by here, I think, well, this is neat. We have a Chinese restaurant, and there's been a Chinese restaurant here. Bob, has there been a Chinese restaurant here as long as you've been in town? Yeah, I think so.
You didn't always have this facade.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's so appropriate because the Chinese had a very important role in early days Siskiyou County and especially Yreka. There was a Chinatown here in Yreka. In fact, if we look down and see the lights and we see the central off-ramp and overpass there across the creek where the Blue Goose is, all that area there was part of the Chinatown. And when I say Chinatown, in my mind, what I mean by that is that it was a place where the Chinese that were in this local area, either for the most part working in mining or later on as they had pressure put on them into service work in these communities, they would have a place that if they came into Yreka, well, that was interesting. And he survived. That was even more interesting. If they came into the community, they would be able to find everything that they would locally have been able to find in China, right here. And I'm saying that included Chinese food, Chinese medicine, herbal medicine, Chinese prostitutes. They would have had a Josh house, which would have been a ceremonial like a church. They would have had a Chinese hotel, so they could have stayed with other Chinese, everything you could possibly have wanted. The Chinese were a fascinating group in how they came to California and how they brought their culture and their heritage with them. It was really different than any of the other ethnic groups as far as I'm concerned. And this is how it worked. Almost all the Chinese that came here were young men. I mentioned prostitutes, and there were some young Chinese women, but I do not think they ever wanted to come to California for that reason. They were shanghaied. They were brought here under duress. But the young Chinese men heard, like everybody else throughout the world, about this big gold rush on what they call Gold Mountain. That's what they call California. They wanted to come here. They wanted to make some money like they'd heard other people had, and then they wanted to go back to China. None of the Chinese had ever intended of coming to California and staying here. That was not their intent. But they were all poor, or relatively poor. So how do you come to California? How do you get started gold mining if you're a poor person? Well, you went to one of the 6 companies that existed. They were benevolent societies, you might call them, that would loan the individual Chinese men money. And that money would be paid for their transportation across the ocean from China to San Francisco. It would pay for them to get started, to mine, all the equipment they needed, some food, and they would sign a contract. The contract said that over a period of so many years, they would pay back that money of their loan. And so every one of these Chinese individuals that came over signed a contract, and there were agents of these 6 companies that would travel around checking on each one of the young miners or other people, as if they turned out to be like washer people, like these people right behind this building. They would have checked on them and gotten their pay. And one of the agreements of the Chinese contract was that if they were so unfortunate to die in California, they would not be buried here, because even though we hear the story about Chinese cemeteries, that's not exactly the way it was in the early days. The Chinese weren't about ready to be buried here. They had to be buried where their ancestors were buried. So they would have in their contract something saying their bones would be shipped back to San Francisco, and then from there by ship back to China where they could be buried. And that in fact was done. There's many manifests of wagon loads of equipment or supplies that include packages of bones headed back to San Francisco that would then be sent to China. And the 6 companies were very good about doing that and making sure that that was in fact done. So when we hear about Chinese cemeteries, the fact is no Chinese would have ever wanted to be buried here. They were probably a place where their bones of the bodies would have been cleaned up in preparation for transportation. After the Chinese were here a generation or more, suddenly the idea of having to go back to China kind of died out. Later on, the Chinese that would have died here if they had been here 30, 40 years, no doubt then they got buried here because it was not that important to be sent back to China. But the earliest Chinese did not end up in cemeteries. So let's continue. I wish we could go in there.
Coke crates and the cash register.
Yeah, I was going to say the cash register is really neat, and look at the safe. I would love to have that safe, but I don't think I have a strong enough floor for it.
We had one like that in the old appliance store.
Really?
I left it there because nobody could move it.
How much do you think that would weigh, Ron?
Oh my God, I haven't a clue.
Those old safes were
That
amazing.
was even heavier than ours, I think.
I understand that part of the thing about these big safes is they want to make sure that people would, when they look at it, that they would say, wow, that looks like no one could break in there. So part of it, was this mental image of its safety. But anyway, I talked a little bit about Captain Jack and one of the Modoc Indians that lived in the area that we now call Tule Lake, Lower Klamath area, or Upper Klamath Lakes. And they were thought of by the other tribes as being a fairly fierce group. They were a tough bunch, and they were especially feared because they had this nasty habit of being slavers. They would go around, and the other adjacent tribes, whether it was Shasta or the Pitt River or downriver even a little ways, some of those tribes, they would make raids and steal their children, or especially young females, and because there was a market within the Indian world to sell them. And so that was one of the ways that they survived in a very rough area, was to find slaves. And the place where they would take these slaves to trade them with other tribes was in a place that we now call the Dalles, Celilo Falls. It's on the Columbia River, where the east side of Oregon meets the west side of Oregon. It was a very important trading center. So that was the Modoc Indians, but the Modocs would travel around long distances. In fact, like I said, they were here when this fire started on 4th of July, 1871. They were here to do some business, but their home was more than 100 miles away. And the business they were doing was talking with some lawyers, because they understood the lawyers were the key to try to explain to them how they could try to keep their land. More and more white people were coming in, and more white people were taking land that the Modocs had traditionally thought of as being their land. And the Modocs found that they weren't able to even stay on land that their grandparents and great-grandparents had been on. So the Modocs came over to find out what to do. The story I've heard is that several of the local lawyers wanted the Indians over there to do something called homesteading. Homesteading was something that all of people that once they come to this country were allowed to do. If you had an unoccupied piece of land that no one else claimed, no one else said that it was their land, you could get 160 acres around here, and many people did that for ranches, farms, whatever. The local lawyers suggested that that the Indians do that. And especially if several Indians did it in contiguous blocks of land, you would basically have a reservation. If you got enough Indians to claim 160 acres that were next to each other, it got to be a pretty large area. Well, but that was illegal, because in those days Indians were not allowed to homestead land that they traditionally considered theirs to be, as long as there were people, that was their land, but legally they were not allowed to homestead. The lawyers here were very smart. They knew that it wasn't legal, but they wanted to take that to the Supreme Court to test that, to say, Modocs, why don't you try to do that, and then we're going to fight it through the court. The Modocs weren't the kind of people that wanted to fight things through the court. They were a very warrior type people. And the year after this fire got started, 1871, in fact, the war started, when the Modocs felt that they were being pushed too much. They weren't willing to give up any more land, and the war started. If you go to Lava Beds National Monument, it's a great place to see where the war happened and to read about the events that happened. And Yreka was the center, not the center of the war, but all the distribution of goods, the soldiers, etc., were at one time or another went right up and down Minor Street. We would have seen many pack trains and wagons leaving from here, headed out to the war zone, which would have been almost 100 miles east of here. And of course the Modocs won, even though it was an interesting war, because at the beginning the Modocs had a lot of support throughout the world, and it was a worldwide news event. And they got a lot of support because a lot of people thought, well, the Modocs are fighting for what's right, for their own land, and the Modocs were winning the war at the beginning, which was new. There weren't very many Indian wars where the Indians were winning the war, and so a lot of people, especially in Europe, were very supportive of the Modocs in their war. At the end of the war, they caught the ringleaders, Captain Jack. They hung him along with several of his partners at a place called Fort Klamath, and the rest of the Modocs, they carted right up from the war zone. They carted right down Minor Street here, and then they went over Scott Valley, over the top of the mountain to Trinity River, and then to the new town of Reading, which just got a railroad. And from Reading, they were put on cattle cars and taken to where all Indians were supposed to end up, which was, can you imagine where that would have been? Where were Indians supposed to go in those days? Oklahoma. So the Modoc Indians ended up in Oklahoma. They have a small reservation which still exists today. Even though some of the Modocs, many of the Modocs have come back to their ancestral area, but they still have a reservation in eastern Oklahoma. Yep. And they would have gone right through here on wagons, going to Reading to get on to the train to go back to Oklahoma. One of the interesting events during the Modoc War was that the president at the time, Grant, thought that maybe one of the solutions to the Indian problems was to try to negotiate, try to take a kinder, gentler approach toward dealing with the Indians. And so he asked the general who was in charge of the army on the West Coast, who was by the name of General Canby, to negotiate with the Modocs. And so they sat down for negotiation, and that didn't go well because Captain Jack and a few of the other Indians snuck in some firearms, knives, and they killed two of the white folks, and that, of course, did not go over very well with the army, and that was the ultimate downfall of the Modocs, because the Modocs thought that if they killed the leader of the army, that in their way of thinking, maybe the Army would have just gone home, but that's not the way our Army does things, so that was the end of the end of the Modocs. So that was the first time in any Indian war that a general had been killed in an Indian war. And his body, after they prepared it as well as they could, went right down Minor Street. After it came over, it goes the gap between Goose Nest Mountain and Willow Creek Mountain. It went right over through there, Little Shasta River, through what is now Montague, approximately, right down Minor Street. And they had one of the largest events ever in Yreka, which was at the old Masonic Hall, which is where the new Masonic Hall is, just right up here where Cooley and Pollard's Hardware is, or was. A lot of people, as they come through Yreka, they'll stop here, especially since they pruned the tree. For a while, the tree was kind of hanging down. You could barely even see this. But now it's a nice, you know, in a paragraph it describes the history of Yreka. And so I think it's a very nice monument here. But I think what I'm going to talk about here is not the monument, but the rocks that exist behind it, the stones. And you can see, if you look closely, the handwork that's been placed in making these stones. These are all sandstones, that's the type of stone this is, from a local quarry. And there are several sandstone quarries here locally. In fact, there's a quarry court if you go between Yreka and Montague, just on the left side, as you're headed that way. It's Quarry Court, it's named because of one of the quarries. If you go on Oberlin Road, over the top of the little pass there as you're headed into Shasta Valley, on the left side there's at least 2 quarries, and so they were quarrying sandstone for construction in Yreka and the local area. Even in Hawkinsville, at the tour that I gave last Sunday, I noticed that the entranceway, the step going into the church in Hawkinsville, is made out of the same sandstone from the same quarries. So they were trying to get stones locally, so they didn't have to transport them very far. They were heavy stones, but you can see them on Minor Street. As we go up, you'll see most stores where you can see part of the foundation. It'll be made out of these. The houses on 3rd Street or Oregon Street, the older houses, almost all of them will have sandstone as part of their foundation. But I think you can see right through here the pock marks and the gouges. These are all handmade. They started off with these stones that they blocked out of the quarry, and then of course they had to make them square or rectangular in shape, and that took handwork. And we can see it right here. So I get a kick out of this. To me, that tells me too that in the old days, especially before the railroad got here, is that anything that was bulky or heavy had to be, if possible, produced locally. They weren't going to pack that very far. And that goes to bricks. We'll see bricks up here, and there were at least 2, possibly 3 brickyards right here in Yreka, where we made our own bricks. One was near Evergreen School. One was just a little bit west and north of the Minor Street Park. And one of them may have been up Lane Street, someplace a ways up there.
The old sleep ranch in the lane.
Yeah. And I've talked with people on Evergreen, where Evergreen School is now, and they all talk about how terrible the soil is. They have some real drainage problem, and it's very clay. And it makes perfect sense that that's the place that they would have made, you know, bricks. And here, I'll point out some of these sandstones that you maybe haven't noticed before or haven't paid attention to. But again, you can imagine This is a large block here. I don't know how much this would weigh, but this would be a heavy block. And that would have been and quarried. In fact, on some of the stones, excuse me, some of the stones you can actually see the remains or the remnants of these drill holes that they made to start blocking this sandstone out of the cliffs before they would then try to make them rectangular or square in shape. And look at this one here. Again, the really old sandstone on top of really old brick. On top of rocks from someplace else. This is a really interesting one here. As I said, this I think is one of the really old store facades. Frontage looks in Yreka, one of the older ones. Trying to put into context the importance of Yreka in the early days is a little bit difficult because we think of it now as this, little county, small town. But at one time, Yreka was one of the really important towns in California. One of the ways I think about that is in the early newspapers, they would talk about Anton's bookstore, and Anton was a very well-known book dealer, and his advertisements, it would say Anton's bookstores, San Francisco, Yreka. And you think, well, the two places you'd pick to put big bookstores, it was San Francisco and Yreka, and the answer is yeah. When we had our big fire, 1871, in those days before there was FEMA and disaster relief and everything, cities a lot of times would get together, donate money, and contribute it. And the city of San Francisco was the largest contributor to Yreka for relief after that fire. And it was interesting, after 1906 earthquake and fire in San Francisco, Yreka was a major contributor to San Francisco in the same way. That's all I can say is, kind of makes you see that. And I would say in the early days, almost everybody in Yreka had a strong connection with San Francisco.
Maybe Yreka should contribute more to San Francisco now.
Well, Bob, maybe so. Right where we crossed the Minor Street down here, I didn't mention it, but the Oddfellows building is just down there here, and that's one of the really old buildings in Yreka, and unfortunately the Oddfellows, I don't know if they're technically deceased, but they're pretty close to it. The members are very few, and they're on in age, but the Masonic group is still here. Have all of you been up to Masonic Hall and gone into the temple? We're going to have a tour, hopefully, soon. I think it's in October or November. It'll be the third or fourth time we've had a tour, and the Masonic people have been really gracious about allowing us to go up there, see some of the things, and go into the temple. And I think the temple is one of the hidden gems of Yreka. It's such a beautiful, unusual place. And the Masonic people don't normally open it up for the public, but it is open for us on our tours. But I think of the fraternal orders, and when I say not only fraternal orders, because almost all these fraternal orders, like the Oddfellows or Masons, had a female side to it also. They were very important in the early days, where we didn't have a lot of social what would you call it, assistance for people like we do now. We don't have medical care, mental care facilities. the way I see it is that these fraternal and sorority organizations kind of fulfilled that role in the old days. They would keep their ear to who needed help and what needed to be done in town, and they were very important in early day Western towns. And the Masons, some people have asked me, they always think that the little symbols on the side of the buildings are, I don't know where they get this idea. They're demonic, they represent all sorts of strange ideas. Well, they're not. I mean, these are the groups of the people that meet there or used to meet there, including the Masons on the very top, that's with the G in the middle, and the G. Well, who knows what the second one down is? No? That's the female side of the Masons, yeah. And so those would have been all the different groups that would have met there. Knights of Pythias was another fraternal organization that used to be here. There used to be a group called the Redmonds that was here in town.
That's right.
Yeah. As our society has changed, and people are spending more and more time inside or doing other types of things, that the fraternal and sorority organizations have really declined. And in my mind, that's unfortunate because of the role that they used to play, of keeping an eye on the community, trying to help out, and I think that was a very important thing. Look at the brick rubble that's in the wall here. That's exposed. Who knows how old that brick is? Or sandstone. They had it covered up, but now it's exposed. Well, Yreka had an old, kind of a rough side to its youth. There was a number of hangings, lynchings that went on. Courthouse was always where it's at now. The jail at one time used to be across the street to the left, and there was one time when 3 bad guys were broken out of jail, drug across 4th Street here into the trees right in front of the courthouse and strung up. Other times, in the real Old West, that would have been the 1850s and 60s, there were people that when they were bad guys, they were drug out on the hill, probably close to where YMCA is now, or between YMCA and the city cemetery. And they had a little scaffolding up there, and they would stretch their necks, so to speak, and then bury them at city cemetery. And if you haven't been to our city cemeteries tour, I would suggest you come to, because that's a lot of fun. City cemetery is the one that now is kind of in a grassy, brushy area. There's not very many headstones, even though they're pretty sure there are more than 3,000 people buried there and maybe 100 headstones. The rest of them do not have headstones because a lot of them were indigent, they were poor, and after Evergreen Cemetery got started, they stopped burying people in city cemetery other than poor people. And those poor people, of course, didn't have enough money for headstones. Other than the little metal markers that the county would give them. The courthouse, Bob has written a number of articles about the courthouse, but courthouse is very old. It's been changed over the years, but at one time, surrounding the courthouse were 3 really nice churches. We can see 2 of them still. The Catholic Church, St. Joseph's with the brick, and then the St. Mark's Episcopal Church, which has now is called Yreka Preservation, is no longer a church, but has performances, etc., music. Still exists, but the Methodist Church, which would have been further to the right, what, about 1960s, Ron?
Yeah.
It would have been torn down? Yeah. It was an old church, lasted quite a while, but they tore it down after a bit.
How many hot dogs did we here?
Yeah.
Kid couldn't get out of here without getting a hot dog.
Yeah. The neat sign that they have up there, it's one of the ones that, there used to be several of these up and down Minor Street, and I think people stole them, but this one still exists. So it's written as if it's still in continuous operation as a meat market. Well, not exactly. Now it's not. But if you've had a chance to go in there, sometimes the people that used to operate this would invite us in, but they've done such a nice job to try to retain some of the old flavor of it being a meat market. The little hooks that used to hang the carcasses are still in there, of course. The paintings on the wall. Let me see. Oh, the rails, or what would you call it? That they put the carcass on that would actually, let them pull them out. I mean, it's still up. It's very nice how they did that. So maybe someday I can get in good with these people and they'll ask us in. One thing I mentioned, it may have been at the beginning, I think it was right at the beginning of the tour, about the Yreka was placed here because they thought it was out of the way of the gold mining. But later on they found that there's gold all the way through town, underneath, but not right on the surface. They would have to dig down, hit bedrock or some sort of flat rock down there a ways, and then try to mine out that material right above the rock, because gold is very heavy, so it'd be very deep. So there, later on, they dug a lot of tunnels through town, and in fact, right in here, I've had permission on some tours to go in here. Even though this door is open, I don't think I should open it because they didn't give me permission, but there's a steep stairway. You go down and you can see a blocked off tunnel. That's one of the gold mining tunnels. Ron used to own the place across the street, and well, what I've heard, because when Ron Washington told me, is sometimes late after work, if it was quiet, you would actually feel a little bit of rumbling of tunnels settling.
Yeah, I guess.
That's the idea. Did you have any tunnels right underneath election licenses?
Not that I know of. There was some old wells and stuff. And then there was a place behind the hotel and behind our appliance store too, where people kept digging bottles, and it was kind of making a mess and stuff. But what we found out was it was an outdoor toilet. The bottles were going in there.
Yeah.
So,
Well, if you go in the Franco-American where we started, there will be a big kind of display case with a lot of things that were dug out right behind the Franco-American. If somebody came, and they were digging, just like Ron said, and they found all sorts of things, because they would have had houses and they would have dumped a lot of things out. And so they have all sorts of things behind there. So there's Jennifer Bryan, who was here, took your money earlier, has a lot of stories. Her dad used to own the meat market right down there, but a lot of stories of cave-ins of these tunnels. I don't know, have any of you heard any or know anything of stories about that? Because she said they would, her family was involved in several ones that they had to fill in. About 3 or 4 years ago, there was a cave-in right in front of St. Mark's Church.
Oh,
And my understanding is these tunnels weren't just right downtown, they went considerably out into the residential areas. If you come to the fundraiser that we're going to have at the Gillis House, which will be early September, the Gillis House, of course, is one of the really beautiful Victorians on North Oregon. There supposedly was a tunnel that extended from that house to Mr. Gillis's office here on Minor Street. And my guess is that he did not build that tunnel intentionally on his own, but it existed before they built the house. They found out about it. He says, "Oh, I can walk in the tunnel on rainy days or whatever." So that's what happened. During the Modoc Indian War, all the supplies, or most of the supplies, came out of Yreka. Most of the Army people would have been funneled through Yreka. And all the news that came from the war front about the battles, the casualties, who was winning, who was losing. There would be daily or several times a day, there would be couriers going from the war front way out there in the Tule Lake to Yreka, to this spot right here, because this was where the Yreka newspaper was, and this was the only place that had a telegraph at that time. So all the news got out through that way, through this location right here, and they became worldwide news articles because it was such an important and interesting news item in those days. So if you read anything, old articles about the Modoc Indian War, no doubt it came from telegraph right.
we found a metal pipe in the basement when we had this,
Really,
from one of the newspaper was here.
that's really the Carnegie Library is right here. Mr. Carnegie made an offer basically to any place, not only in the United States, but in the world that wanted the library, that if the community would find a place to house it, in other words, they had some skin in the game. They bought the land. Well, Mr. Carnegie would contribute money to purchase or to build the library, and so we have our own Carnegie Library. I think right now it's in discussion about what's going to become of it. Hopefully it is remain, or it's restored, it is kept like it is. If you ever seen the Carnegie Library in Ashland, boy, what a beautiful library. They really have done a very nice job in keeping it in good shape and everything. So hopefully the rain is not going to continue, but we'll just have a few more stops and not very much.
Open it up again.
How's everybody doing on bingo? Is everyone getting close? I think some people have given up.
Hard to read or write and walk at the same time.
Yeah, I know. Well, especially with the footing we have here, I don't want anybody to trip. We're going to have a tour of the Elks Building here later this year. It'll be in your schedule that you've been given. It's a really interesting historical building. The bar inside has a lot of history. It's a great bar, and there's the original bullet hole. You'll see the bullet hole where supposedly there was a shootout, and you'll see that, as well as a lot of other things. You know, back to the Carnegie Library. I always am trying to find something interesting that I can add in these tours about how women participated in the old days. And it's not easy because the women were not allowed to participate in very many ways. They weren't allowed to work outside of the home very often. They weren't professional people for the most part. They weren't expected to write about themselves in the newspaper. But the Carnegie Library is a good story about women in the local area, because the women were very instrumental in doing things to improve the community, to bring culture to our town, and they were very instrumental in getting the Carnegie Library here by finding the land, purchasing the land, getting the money for the land, and doing all the paperwork. So that was part of the women's contribution, as well as paving the roads. Believe it or not, it took the women to put pressure on the city to pave the roads. There was a group called the Women's Improvement Club that would try to do things like get overhangs over the sidewalks, to get the sidewalks a hard surface so they wouldn't be muddy, because if you can imagine, with a lot of animals going up and down dirt and sunny and hot and dusty in the summertime and very muddy in the winter, and the women were also very instrumental in trying to improve those conditions right here in Yreka, as well as most other towns. Before the tour started, we were talking a little bit about recent excavations that were made right here, because they had a water leak, and so they had to dig down and find what the problem was, and lo and behold, they found kind of a interesting artifact, which were several sections of wood pipe underground that used to convey, or possibly still conveyed, water along Minor Street. And these were trees, apparently, let me see, were they about this big around, would you say? With a hole, I suppose, about 4 or 5 inches in diameter bored through them. And so these were used as pipes, connected somehow end to end, so that water could be sent up and down Minor Street. Pretty amazing, and I was meaning to bring the newspaper article that showed a picture and also described it. They think it's from probably 1860s, so 150, 160 years old, and still in good shape. And they're on this. One of them is on display now.
I believe it's the City Hall in our case. They brought it in, showed us, and they took it out, but I think they put it back in.
Maybe
the
back in
case,
City
but
Hall. Yeah,
it might be.
that's really neat. Another thing, and who knows exactly how that pipe served the city from a water standpoint, but I do know that from a firefighting standpoint, virtually every one of these intersections at one time had cisterns located that they would keep filled with water for firefighting purposes. And so we have maps that actually show those cisterns, like there would have been one right there at the corner of Oregon and Minor Street, and one of them right down here at the corner of Minor Street and 4th Street. And you can imagine in those days you needed to have a sure, consistent source of water for firefighting, and that's what they decided to do. Almost everybody that's on a tour is interested in the tunnels, and they wish that we would have a tunnel tour somehow, and I do too. That would be great. But we have evidence of some of these tunnels that we've kind of not understood how important they are, and including right here in the Strings restaurant. There is a place that you used to be able to sit down or walk by and see a tunnel underneath the building. And then I asked the owner of Strings why they have closed that off, why it's covered now. And I was told that when they did some restoration work or renovation, that the inspector said that's something that had to be done. And I wasn't sure exactly what that had to do with the restoration they were doing, but it seems like to me that would in itself be a great tourist attraction. If you can say, you can go and eat in a place where you can look down and see 150, 160-year-old tunnel, I think that would be really neat. But maybe that will happen again in the future. That'd be great. Well, we're almost back to where we started, and we're about on time. And I always think that history a lot of times is just about every place you look, if you know where to look and if you're patient. And one example is right here on our sidewalks. And I look, and scattered all through Yreka, you will see these WPA stamps. And that tells you, there's a pretty interesting story right there. And of course, WPA, does everyone know what WPA is? What is WPA?
It's a works project.
Because I would expect you wouldn't know.
It's a works project.
Yeah. So when was that active?
The Depression era.
So we know pretty close when this side was put in, and there's a number of stamps saying WPA all through Yreka. WPA, of course, was one of the make work projects or processes, I guess, done during the Depression by Roosevelt. My guess is it was from the 1930s, I thought, probably late 20s, early or mid 30s. And there were two groups that we hear about a lot. One was WPA, that seemed to do mainly, I would say, public work type things in towns. I know in Reading they built the main fire station in downtown Reading through the WPA. Out in the country there was the CCCs, and they worked on more building of roads, fighting fire, building bridges, planting trees. They did things out in the woods, and there was a CCC camp. There were several of them around. There was one at Hilt, not far out of Hilt. And so it's an interesting piece of history. And we're back at the Franco-American, which is, I think, probably if there's any iconic spot for Yreka downtown Minor Street, it's probably the Franco-American. The Nelsons and other folks have done a great job to try to keep it looking somewhat like it used to. Our claim to fame, of course, is there was a president that spent the night in there. I mean, it wasn't George Washington, we can't say that, but at least we can say it was a president. And the reason you may say, why was the president staying the night in Yreka? Well, I don't think at that time it was that he was so impressed about coming here, but that was the period of time there was no railroad between Reading and Canyonville, Oregon. So if they wanted to go up and down the West Coast, they had to take a stagecoach, and they had to go through Yreka. So they spent the night here. And along with the president was General Sherman, who was probably more popular and better known than the president at the time. And in those days, the presidents always liked to hang out with Civil War generals because they were very well known and very popular. So with that, that's the end of the tour of Minor Street.
We could add a little on the hotel if you got time.
Pardon?
I said I could add a little on the
I
hotel.
would love to. And then
Yeah. And,
No, I don't even know if I got them right.
We
Just-
owned it years ago,
this is
probably 50
interesting.
years ago we
Yeah.
bought
You
it.
have your pencil.
And then we got a little grant from the state to refurnish the front and rebuild the deck.
Yeah.
That wasn't here at the time. And we thought, well, we'll just sandblast that brick and repaint it. It was all painted at one time. Couldn't sandblast the brick because it was so soft. So my dad and I ended up hand scraping and cleaning all the paint off of all the bricks.
Really?
And then we re-grouted it all.
So
And
this has all been
we did it.
by you and your dad.
My
Oh my
dad and I
goodness
did it,
sakes.
yeah.
My dad.
And cleaned the grout out and stuff. And the grout from the historical advice we had at the time, we couldn't use good grout. They said, don't use a good grout because it's harder than the brick and it'll flake the brick off. So it was all regrouted at the time, and then that was put back. And then up above the deck up here was all windows that they put in after they took the deck out. But take the windows out and those were after. What happened is that people started backing into the columns that were built. So the city built a little
really?
area out there where that is. And so all those trees that look huge now are less than 40 years old probably. But I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, no.
9,000 square feet on each level. There's 36 rooms upstairs and 6 bathrooms.
Real, and try to imagine that, 36 rooms upstairs.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so this was a hopping place at one time. You know,
Yeah,
there was a
uh-huh.
lot of things that went on here. And at one time it was kind of an upper scale place.
Uh-huh.
And the other times it wasn't so, I think. But, you know, and other times there were some disreputable things that probably went on in here. But there's supposed to be ghosts. I guess the ghost hunters have been here, you know, there's everything. So you had something that you went.
Yeah, with the sidewalks in there, where did in the 50s, this was wooden sidewalks, right? Up
Well,
through here,
in the
because,
50s, what was the sidewalk like?
Well, I think it was cement in the 50s.
Yeah.
because
I
we
was
used
sure
to-
here.
But we used to park at an angle.
Yeah, it was all diagonal parking,
And
right?
Louis Berg would
Uh-huh.
roll the feed right out into your pickup
Yeah.
there.
uh-huh.
So
We bought it
it
from
was
Louis.
higher, so they must have
Uh-huh.
raised the street.
Maybe so.
I can't
But-
remember, do you, on the diagonal parking, it started down there somewhere and then it stopped about here, didn't it? I don't think it
Well,
went
where
all the
was
way up.
Louis Berg's? Where
Pardon?
was the seed store?
That was right there. So,
Okay, I know.
was it
that-
diagonal in front of that too?
Yeah, there was like 2 steps all the way up through here.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it seemed like it was, I thought it was wooden, but then again, I'm thinking, I knew
Uh-huh.
it was concrete.
Yeah.
There was a, we
That's
stepped
all I
off
can
the
remember.
sidewalk and stepped down, and then one more step to get to the street.
Uh-huh.
So a pickup with the tailgate down could back right in here
Oh, get,
at an angle, and they wheel the
uh-huh.
seed in it.
I mean, the fact that the WPA, my guess is that, you know, they
Yeah.
did this whole thing
But
through here.
I'm thinking that, I don't know, they raised the street or something else, because it seemed like from this section on up, the sidewalk was a lot higher.
Yeah, I think it was a higher curb, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, when the cars pulled in
Because
on.
that had to be original, so this up here has been changed, you know, I think.
Interesting.
What was the site of the 1850s hospital? Did you mention that?
Oh, I didn't. Is that the one you were waiting for?
No,
It
no,
was
no. Well,
The Hardison
I
Boutique.
was learning.
The Hardison Boutique building. There was a doctor that had his house on 3rd Street, and just down the street, you know, a couple hundred feet. And in those days, the hospitals were in fact put together by, well, a lot of them were by individual doctors. And so I don't know what the hospital really would have looked like, but if you were sick, I guess you would have ended up there until you died, or until
Was
you.
the hospital upstairs as well? Both levels?
I don't know. All I know
I
is
always heard
that,
that there was a hotel upstairs. But I
yeah,
didn't-
well, it's probably had a number of things through
Yeah, sure.
through the years.
Yeah.
Some things that we can't talk about, but some things that we can. But the yeah, that was the hospital, the Hardison Boutique,
Okay.
with the early day. I think that was back in the 1850s, right, when it was.
That's what it
built.
says.
Yeah.
Your
They were
question.
talking about a shooting up at the Elks Club.
Yeah,
The pastime bar was down where
Interesting.
the arch is,
yeah.
and I was selling papers, and the guy walked in and shot the owner with the shotgun
Really?
across the bar, yeah.
Well, I guess that solved this problem.
That
Or-
took care of the problem.
You know, we moved here in 1972, and there was a legendary place that was gone when we got here, but it's still fresh in people's minds.
Con Brown.
Con Brown's.
Oh, sure.
Over there
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah, it was there when I was a kid.
I was gonna
Well,
say,
I better, you graduated my class, right?
what's your name?
Bridwell, Roger Bridwell.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
It's a long time, Mike.
it's been a long time.
So,
Hey.
yeah, it burned in 67. 67.
It burnt.
The Warren's building.
Oh, the Warren's
And,
building.
and Con Brown's was on the last one up this way in the Warren's building.
Oh, was it in the Warren's building?
Yes.
Well,
No,
Was it?
the Warren's
No,
building
still
went
there.
from the other side of the hospice house on down to the next corner.
right.
Oh, you're saying it was this way?
Oh, yeah, it was
No,
this way.
it was farther than the hospice house in the green building.
No,
It
I mean
went-
Con Brown's.
Oh,
It wasn't in
yeah,
the
Con
same-
Brown's is where that wood sign is that's hanging up just past the, it was right in there.
Well, he claimed he had the largest magazine
Well,
assortment on
see,
the West
that's my
Coast.
story about Con Brown's. As a young person, my mom would try to get rid of me. I would bother her down to her office, and she would just give me a quarter or something, say, "Go buy me such magazine." And that's where I'd always go because that did have a great
And you
selection.
snuck in there because it was scary.
You had to
place.
sneak in. It was so
Old men
smoky,
with
and all the
cigars.
windows were greasy.
Playing poker in the back.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
several tables back
And
there.
very intimidating for a young kid to go in there because there's all these crusty guys
grumpy
back there
looking.
looking at you like,
Yeah.
what are you doing in here? So you grab a magazine, you pay over on this side, and then you get the heck out of there.
He did have a bar though, didn't he?
Yeah, there was a long bar. First
And
was,
that was their, it was all wine mostly, because that was their medical marijuana for those old lumber workers. that
yeah, right.
Couldn't move
Uh-huh.
anymore, so. that was the
As you
thing of
walk in the
day.
front door, the magazines were on the right-hand side, and then there was a kind of a counter, and then bar on the left, and then the tables were behind that.
Yeah, that's right. It was,
This was at its lowest point before we started fixing things up along here. It was really in terrible shape. And they said they were having a meeting at the fire hall, and they said, "What do we do if Minor Street catches on fire?" One guy said, "Go to 3rd Street and backfire." Thank
goodness
it got saved.
yeah. Well, I was thinking, I mean, the old buildings, I just get a real kick out of seeing these old buildings, but I mean, we're sure lucky we don't live in an earthquake-prone area. That's all.
my gosh.
I mean, gee whiz, I don't think we'd have these buildings here. But anyway.
Speaking of that, you see on that building over there where that backwards S is?
Yeah.
That's a wash to go through to hold the building together.
And my guess is that they would have done that after as a
Yeah.
form of support to try to keep things down. I've seen that in other places too, where they've later gone in and put some of that supportive.
And that, now you
Yeah.
don't see it.
The
yeah.
two buildings on the very corner up there, the last two buildings and stuff, when we had those up in the attic, and there's about that much dirt, as far as I know,
Yeah.
still in the ceiling,
Yeah,
and they put it in there because of the fires.
that's what I hear.
Because the ceilings that catch on fire burn down to the dirt and go out.
I used to give tours at Old Shasta, which is just out of Reading. And very interesting. It's state park, and they would say the same thing. Is that was considered in the old days not only some insulation, but also I'm not sure I understand the logic. But if you get a fire started and it burns through, this dirt would collapse. It seemed by the time that it burned through and collapsed to put out a fire, that the thing would have
too
been
late,
burned
yeah.
up anyway.
Oh,
But,
yeah. They told us that we'd just burn down to the dirt and go out. But I always worried about the roof leaking and that dirt getting wet and having an avalanche inside. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing. And then, of course, a lot of people, no one asks on this door, but they always wonder now, why is there a door sticking up there just over
Yeah.
2 or 3 stories?
You know, it's been like that as long as I can remember.
I always thought it's, when people were really depressed, they could just go out that door.
That's right, yeah, right.
In that year, it used to be, Cleaver's office was upstairs,
Yeah,
the dentist,
sure.
and you'd look across, and you'd see that.
He
Well-
was our dentist.
My guess is with that door, there must have been a balcony there at one time, so it probably
think
made
so.
sense,
We're talking about Alex Rosenborough,
but, yeah.
and he was a good friend of Churchill's, Jerome Churchill Sr.'s. And Jerome Churchill, when we were little kids, would tell us about Captain Jack coming over here and trying to get things done. And of course, we wish we'd have paid more attention now than we did, but he had lots of stories about Captain Jack.
This judge, and that would have been, I guess, Alex's dad. That was the lawyer,
Uh-huh.
and then he became a judge. But I said a little while ago that I used to give tours down in Old Shasta, which, if you haven't been there, that's an amazing place. But in the courthouse there, which has been restored, and it's a really interesting courthouse and jail downstairs and everything, there's a beautiful portrait of Judge Roseborough.
Oh, really?
And I think that's
yeah.
really interesting because he became, I don't know if it'd be the district judge or whatever, but he was based out of Old Shasta. And, you know, I talk about him on 3rd Street. He was an important person and apparently and he was trying to help the Indians the best he could. You know, he was compassionate toward their plight. And, but it's interesting to get a good picture of him. You have to go down to Old Shasta
Oh,
to
yeah.
see it.
That's interesting. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because he used to be a judge down there. So, well, thank you very much, folks.
Good to see you. It's been a long time. Let me shake your hand again.
I really learned a lot. Thanks.
Well, thank you for coming. I'm glad you come and contribute, you know, your thoughts and your.
Learned a lot.
Do you want to see if anybody was